I have to speak up again for QAnon and the importance of what I'm convinced is a military intelligence operation that is, for the first time, assisting us in a manner that does not violate security protection laws, keeping so many things classified and away from us. I think that is a very important development that is not only being watched by many Americans, it's being watched by others worldwide. And I would certainly suggest that the Yellow Vest movement in Europe is greatly influenced by QAnon.
Hey friends, Sean from SGT Report here with a very interesting interview and welcoming back a great guest. It's Wayne Jett. He is a managing principal at Classical Capital. ClassicalCapital.com is where you can get his book, The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. And guys, I have to tell you, after our last interview back on December 19th, that one was called Their Plan Has Always Been Pure Evil. Wayne sold a lot of books, and I want to thank you. You are the most generous audience out there. I've said that so many times before. Wayne, it's true, ain't it?
Well, it is. And as a matter of fact, they were not only a great understanding audience, but one that understood from the standpoint that our sellout of inventory took place before the sunset, the day you released it. And as a result, many of them had to wait quite a while, and they've been very kind, very understanding, and sometimes almost a little too patient, because in the few cases that we had that didn't get the order some way or other, sometimes they were delayed quite a bit. But anyway, I'm very happy with your audience. They're knowledgeable and have been very receptive to the information I've tried to put out about the Great Depression.
Yeah, and you're a stand-up guy, I have to say, folks. Wayne did something nice for me as a result of that. I had no anticipation or expectation of anything, and he sent me a nice little stipend as a thank you, and I really appreciate that, Wayne. That makes you a stand-up guy, that's for sure. And I wanted to ask you something, Wayne. As we take, and by the way, before we started this interview, guys, I joked to Wayne, we ought to be careful. Maybe I shouldn't mention his book, The Fruits of Graft, because it'll probably be banned from Amazon, just like my friend Kerry Rivera's book about treating autism was a day or two after we talked about that recently. You got to love the modern day book burning coming from Amazon. Hopefully they won't ban your book. But your experience with Amazon hasn't been great anyway, has it?
Well, I prefer and give a preferred price on my website. Amazon charges something like 25% of gross for its the use of its platform, which it seems to me is very excessive. And nevertheless, the important thing is to get the message out. I try to use whatever venue I have to in order to do that. Because this modern day book banning is not at all modern. It has existed certainly expressly in the plan of the ruling cabal, as I call it, the ruling elite, however you wish to phrase it. As we discussed last time, from 1901, their plan has been in writing, and it includes controlling the publishers, controlling access to information at all levels in the United States, and of course the world, but we're talking specifically about America here. And their approach to that has been reflected in other instances. Tragedy and Hope was a very striking example of the way that was a very important book that was written by something of an insider, Georgetown University professor, a very, very comprehensive compendium on various aspects of history, but revealing some of the inside operations of the ruling elite.
Carol Quigley, right?
Yes, that's right. And they not only stopped his publication, his publisher finally confessed to him that they had broken up the plates without telling him, so it couldn't be reprinted, and had acted like there was no demand for it. So that's the kind of thing that has gone on. The availability of my book in public libraries in the country is almost non-existent. There are a few academic libraries which have bought it, but This is a comprehensive effort. It's by no means just on the new media. It's just that the new media has been more effective in fighting back than other avenues, such as through academia, through the mainstream press, and so forth. And all of those are certainly targets for control by the ruling cabal. So I think that my book presaged the coming out of our first ever attempt to actually uproot the ruling cabal worldwide that began in 2016. And when my book came out in 2011, there wasn't much of a glimmer of hope on the horizon for such an opportunity. But I'm very thankful for it now, and I'm looking forward to very important events, as we've already seen, but also additional important events in the future.
Yeah, me too. And it begs the question as we look forward to the 2020 election, who do the Democrats have that can challenge this president? You know, Biden's got his hands full because he's creepy, and I literally mean hands full, the way he's all touchy-feely with women and little girls at these swearing-in ceremonies. The videos are legend. The guy is as creepy as the day is long. But now he's got his hands full, too, with his dealings in the Ukraine and his son's dealings in the Ukraine. And the real collusion that Mueller was investigating really should have surrounded not President Trump, not the Trump organization or the Trump campaign or anyone in that campaign. The real investigation about collusion, Wayne, should have been focused on Hillary Clinton and the DNC and Barack Obama and the CIA, Brennan Clapper, and now I think we might actually get that investigation. There's some very patriotic politicians like Devin Nunes and others that are calling for just that. So the question is, though, who do the Dems have that they can run against this guy, against this president in 2020? I don't see that they have anybody. And by the way, Hillary hasn't thrown her hat in the ring either, has she?
Well, I think there's been some indication that Biden is only deigning to consider running as a stand-in for her and would step aside if she did. After all, who is going to oppose a person who seems to be so deadly in her reach? And so, in that circumstance, I see nobody being an effective candidate. I saw the former head of the coffee chain on television this morning being interviewed about his attempt at it. Supposedly a businessman. What's the name of the coffee chain? I don't go there.
Starbucks, I think.
Starbucks,
Starbucks.
that's right, yes. And in any event, that party is so, I believe, poisonously handicapped by the kind of political agenda it's revealing itself to have. It really is a defense of the ruling cabal that is just so antithetical to ordinary people that I simply don't believe it's going to have nearly as much of an appeal. I have to say that I felt the Democratic Party had a very unattractive candidate the last time, but both because of the success that the president has achieved in his first 2 years, as well as the radicalism that has surfaced even further in the Democratic Party, I think that President Trump should have a straightforward opportunity to be reelected. I'll put it that way.
Well, one wonders how many of their candidates that are running might be indicted before 2020. Hillary Clinton specifically may well find herself indicted before 2020. She should anyway.
Well, I think that's a distinct possibility, and frankly, I have held the view that some of these people announcing their candidacy is specifically for the purpose of trying to ward off an indictment, because they will accuse that it is because they are a political candidate, and therefore as a challenger to the president is clearly a political attack that is being focused on them as a defense to the crimes for which they're accused. So we'll see about that. Politics is not my forte, I'll put it that way. I try to view classical economics and what the proofs are that the policies of our government have so far, it's easy to trace that the institutions of our government have been very much a part of this 1901 plan to destroy the middle class, that it's hard to defend the political programs of either party in the administrations of most presidents that we've had. To some extent, that even applies. It does apply, frankly, to even the presidency of John F. Kennedy. The Democratic Party platform at that time was clearly establishment, as the Republican Party was. The event of the 60s, after the assassination of President Kennedy, was the nomination of Barry Goldwater at the 64 convention, which was in effect a runaway convention. It was supposed to go to Nelson Rockefeller, and certainly that was a Kabbalist representative in spades. But he was Barry Goldwater was demolished by the mainstream media, and supposedly the groundswell for Lyndon Johnson, a guy that was right at the point of being indicted himself for multiple crimes when he was put on the ticket, and basically was able to avert those indictments simply because of his power in office. But we could go on and on about those things of the past. What we're looking at now is an opportunity to really make some headway against this global elitist cabal. And I think there have been important reports. I have to speak up again for QAnon and the importance of what I think is, I'm convinced, is a military intelligence operation that is for the first time assisting us in a manner that does not violate security protection laws, keeping so many things classified and away from us. They've approached the disclosure of information in a way that involves many more people than just the insiders of the press on what is going on inside our government and in other parts of the world. I think that is a very important development that is not only being watched by many Americans, it's being watched by others worldwide. And I would certainly suggest that the Yellow Vest movement in Europe is greatly influenced by QAnon and the information that is involved there. We're not talking about conspiracy theories in QAnon, which is the way the mainstream media describes that information source. We're talking about information that's very usable and very applicable in everyday understanding of what events are transpiring and why certain things are being done in one way rather than another.
I'm really glad you brought up Q. And the reason I'm glad you brought it up, Wayne, is that you're a measured human being. You're a knowledgeable historian. You understand the deep state. You understand the history of this country. And for you to vouch for Q, and by the way, Q doesn't need you or me or anybody else to vouch for whoever Q is or whatever Q is, because the Q proofs at qproofs.com says it all. There's been many Q proofs. This thing, had it actually been a LARP, would have certainly been uncovered and revealed by now in detail. And so there's a lot more to Q than meets the eye. In March 29th, Q posted this, post 3310. Threat to controlled narrative. Other than POTUS, can you name a group more attacked than Q by the fake news media? Multiple tactics deployed, including framing for crimes, think bridge, mob boss, etc., etc., desperation, reconcile using logic, think for yourself, dividers will fail. The best news of the year is that the Mueller report is done. This whole witch hunt has ended. And now the real witch hunt can begin, which is to go after the hardcore criminals that have been involved in sedition and, in some cases, treachery and treason against the government. And we've got a big year, or a couple years ahead of us, Wayne. And I wanted to ask you this as it relates to this president. In our last interview, you mentioned that FDR did his level best to make sure the Great Depression was as long and deep as possible, and he took specific steps to do that. This president has said that the fake news media is one of the greatest enemies of the people. I would say that the Federal Reserve is the other great enemy of the people. How would you rate how President Trump has handled the Fed, one of the enemies of the people, I think, in our nation, while he's been in office, versus maybe what FDR did? Is there a way you can sort of compare and contrast? And then explain to us how and why FDR wanted to make sure the Great Depression devastated this nation.
Well, I would say that in terms of what President Trump has done, he's been, I think, more effective than any president I can remember in terms of getting his way with the Fed. And in terms of getting the economy going again, certainly he did a tremendous thing on the fiscal side with his tax cut. That was very important, and was able to get that done near the end of his first year, despite all of the distractions of this very serious coup attempt. And in the circumstance, basically, with the Fed, he has kept them from doing more harm. I think by this time they would have taken action to with further rate increases on interest rates, even though they are abnormally low. There is a house of cards with interest rate derivatives that will have very serious effects on the economy, I think, if and when interest rates actually are allowed to normalize. Hopefully that is going to be neutralized before that happens. But he has been very effective, and he's in the position to be even more effective because he has just appointed another member of the Fed board who will be very much an ally. And he has a couple of more appointments that will even give him a tighter control in terms of giving more influence of the president over a private institution that is majority owned by the Rothschild family through the big money center banks, its ownership of those. Most people don't understand that the private corporation, that is the Federal Reserve, is its shares are owned in proportion to the assets of the banks, which are members of the Federal Reserve. And that reportedly gives the Rothschild family a majority ownership of something over 50% of the Federal Reserve shares. And I'm certainly convinced that the Fed is actually operated out of the New York Fed, and not really by the Board of Governors itself. They get all the attention. That's part of the media distraction to it. But the open market operations are all conducted from New York at the New York Fed. And those are essentially rubber stamped by the Board of Governors or by the Open Market Committee, as they call it, when they meet. So in those circumstances, I'm looking forward to more actions. But as I said last time, I think the president has to be very careful that the Fed doesn't crash the dollar, make the dollar worthless before he's ready for it, because the nation's business and commerce needs to balance its current account deficit. I thought when we spoke last time that perhaps there was real headway being made on that, but I've heard from a source within the past few weeks that our current account deficit is still running something on the order of $850 billion a year. We have to get that way down toward zero before we can go to a gold-backed currency, which the rest of the world is going to go to. The rest of the world, including China, including Russia, Brazil, and the BRICS nations and so forth, are already ready to go to a currency that has reliable value and can actually be reliably exchanged for real value, meaning for gold, in the relatively near term. This is not something that's off past the horizon to occur. It's going to be much sooner than that. Now, in terms of you gave me the opportunity to refer back to the Great Depression. I said last time there were half a dozen things that I didn't get to last time that Roosevelt did to really make the Depression, to nail it, to make it as bad as possible. In effect, it was a genocide to starve as many people to death as possible and to do as much damage as possible to the middle class. That means the middle class, meaning every person who works for a living, no matter whether he makes millions or whether he makes just a bare living for his family. That's what the middle class is. And the intention, the expressed intention of the global elite was to wipe out the middle class, destroy it entirely. So there's only two classes left, the rulers and their slaves or serfs. Now, just getting to what Roosevelt did, in addition to what I covered last time, he did a number of things to take the burden off the Fed of creating the deflation that they wanted in the country. The Fed didn't do it, Roosevelt did. And the primary means that he used to do that was to buy tremendous amounts of gold in the open market on foreign exchange. The money he used to do that came from tax revenues and from borrowing from the private economy through government bonds. The amounts that he borrowed and took from the economy through taxes were tremendous amounts. Just let me give you an example that as of 1930, the total gold reserves accumulated in the entire U.S. history was a little over 6,000 tons of metric tons of gold. Now, even that had been greatly increased from 1900. Most of that 6,000 tons had been accumulated because of the industrial growth of the U.S. in those first 30 years of the 20th century. So 6,000 tons was a lot for that time. But beginning at that point, the first 8 years that FDR spent in office, he bought an additional 13,185.3 metric tons of gold out of tax revenues and money borrowed out of the U.S. economy, while people were starving to death, taking money out of the economy to buy gold and hoard it, and to demonetize it, that is, to sterilize it, not allowing currency to be created based on the new gold he was buying. That is why in 1933, the governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, was quoted in the press as saying, "This is the worst news yet. The whole world will be bankrupted." When I first read that comment on the part of the very conservative, soft-spoken, never in the press head of the Bank of England, I thought, how could he possibly be so upset about Roosevelt buying some gold? Well, he must have known the whole plan, because the plan was to use the money, to strip the money out of the American economy, to buy that gold and to keep it from being remonetized, so there would be this severe deflation, and so nobody else in the world would have gold. He was buying it from the other central banks because they needed it to feed their money to feed their people. And so in that circumstance, that was the primary way that he absolutely stripped money out of America. That's why nobody during the Great Depression had any money. That's what everybody said if you asked them how they're doing. Nobody has any money. I could get into the figures of exactly what it did. For example, gross private domestic investment in 1929, it dropped 92% between 1929 and the end of 1932. 92% reduction in gross private domestic investment in United States industry and production, for example. Now, that happened because money was stripped out of the economy by both the crash and the continued financial fraud from Wall Street that was greatly inhibiting the confidence, and going forward, unemployment, of course, was up to 30% or so. And with that almost complete shutdown in private investment in those 29 to 32, you had a circumstance in which, if anything, you needed to have more investment in the private economy with that no private investment. And yet, what did Roosevelt do? Of course, he was elected to fix that problem. He did exactly the opposite by not only refusing to repeal the tax increase that quadrupled the lowest rate and broadened the lowest rate of income tax. Even the poorest people were taxed badly by Hoover and by the Democratic Congress that passed it in 32. But rather than fixing that, Roosevelt immediately upon taking office not only confiscated gold and required Americans to turn in their gold for $20.67, he immediately went on the open market and started buying gold, and in doing so was paying up to $40+ an ounce, probably to his cronies in the ruling cabal, the big banks. And so in those circumstances, that was his central program of what he was doing. But I'd like to mention to you a few things that happen in addition to that.
Well, let me just say something here real quickly, Wayne, because it occurs to me again earlier in the interview when I mentioned the Federal Reserve as being one of the enemies of the people. What I'm really saying is Rothschild. What I'm really saying is the central banks around the globe. These people have plagued us since the birth of our country. And I want to just share something here at the end of the conversation, or maybe I should just do it now because it comes right back to the damn Rothschilds again. So let me just do that quickly because I do have a hard out today, as I mentioned to you. I have to go pick up my daughter, so we've only got about 8 minutes left. But let me just say this. As I say, the Democrats are morally bankrupt. Who do they have to run against this president? The Democrats as a whole are for ninth-month abortion, open borders, and their anti-Second Amendment. Then you have people like Adam Schiff, who's a liar and a leaker who President Trump says should resign from Congress. Then you have Jussie Smollett in Chicago, who's probably going to be prosecuted by the DOJ for mail fraud. You've got Loretta Lynch, the tarmac issues with Bill Clinton, when clearly dirty dealings went down. President Trump knows all about it, so look for more trouble for Loretta Lynch. Michael Avenatti, the creepy porn lawyer who said he was going to run for president, is now an embezzler of money from his own clients who's facing hard time in prison. Then you have the people at Nixium, Allison Mack and the Bronfmans, involved in child sex trafficking or human trafficking. You've got AOC Cortez, a puppet candidate chosen from 10,000 people who auditioned for the role and was chosen. Then you have Biden, a creepy old man with Ukraine connections. And here's the payoff, the Ukraine connections. Ukraine is a proxy state for the deep state. And get this, Ukraine President Poroshenko, his income suddenly rose 10,000% due to mysterious Rothschild fund. Get this, most of Poroshenko's income, around $40 million, reportedly comes from returns on an investment in Zurich-based Rothschild Trust Schweiz, a subsidiary of Rothschild Bank. And I'll end this comment with John McCain, whose biggest supporter was Lynn DeForester Rothschild, another former politician, a dead politician that our president has disdain for. So I just wanted to share that with folks as you round this out, because FDR was working as a proxy. He was working on behalf of the cartel banks, which always goes back to Rothschild. And today, in the news today, the same Rothschild family manipulating our country, manipulating politics and geopolitics. It never ends, Wayne.
Well, I do think that we're going to see events and information of a tremendously striking quality between now and the 2020 election. I don't think the issues that are in front of the public, even yet, are nearly what they need to be. You certainly know that the topics. The human trafficking thing has got to come to the fore any day, I would think. And certainly it's starting to do so with Nexium. But these things have very human faces across the country and around the world. And there have been people involved in them that need to be called out. And I think will be. I think that certainly the previous candidate, obviously she was shielded from having her criminal investigations proceed by entirely illicit means the last time. And so we'll look to see whether even that comes out. It certainly should. There's no further reason for delay at this point, I think. And I believe there will be other things as well with plenty of other politicians in the House, in the Senate, and those running for the presidency. Yeah. So we'll see how that goes. But I thank you for having me back again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And literally in these last 4 or 5 minutes, could you just give us the Cliff Notes version of what you wanted to share there about FDR? Because the history is very important, Wayne, because obviously those who don't understand history are condemned to repeat it. In the deep state and the Rothschilds, these bankers love to whip humanity over and over and over using the same plans over and over and over again. But I think humanity's finally waking up.
Well, let me start on that just a little bit. For one thing, for example, in 1935, the Federal Reserve Act was reformed and giving FDR more or less more control over the Federal Reserve Board. As soon as his new appointees gave him control of it, they held a meeting in August of 1936. The first act they took was to increase the reserve requirements on all banks by 50%. Now, by that time, there was no run on the banks. The banks that were still in existence essentially were not in trouble. They were not failing. But that reserve requirement required them to basically call in half of their loans. That was in August of 36. That's when you started having the additional wave of foreclosures of farmers and of homes and so forth. Those were the lenders at that time, the small banks. And they were having to call in their loans, whether they were performing loans or whether they were in default. Just because the Federal Reserve did. Why did they do that? They said, oh, well, we just want to show them who's boss. That was clearly a way of stamping out the competition of the big banks, trying to make as many smaller banks fail as possible. And in January of 37, they did the same thing again, another 33% increase in Federal Reserve, in bank reserve requirements, requiring performing loans to be shut down and foreclosed so they could pick them up for a few cents on the dollar. That's the way the big agricultural giants got so many acres of land by people being run off their farms. And in terms of goal sterilization.
Oh, can I just say one thing? And we got to
Yes.
wrap this up here quickly. And I'm really sorry for the hard out because I enjoy speaking with you, but it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing we saw the Rothschilds do after the Battle of Waterloo. Drive the prices of everything down and then pick up all of the hard assets at pennies on the dollar. It's the exact same thing that FDR arranged for these power elite to do because of the Great Depression. So you're right. So now, and what are we stuck with today? These agri-giants giving us GMOs, destroying family farms, and giving us their corporatized toxic food. And look what they're doing to chicken farms. Look what they're doing. I mean, they abuse animals just like they abuse human beings, folks. This is a giant plantation, and we all need to get off it.
Well, there's another aspect about what they're doing, and that is the geoengineering has produced flooding of absolutely historic proportions, farmland. A great proportion of productive farmland in this country right this minute is under floodwaters, and we will have no food production from it this year. That is another global cabal operation. These weather conditions are produced by geoengineering, which is not only highly destructive to the climate, but it is very poisonous to human beings and every other type of life. But we have a real food production problem coming in the United States of America now because of the floods that have been caused by this. The cabal is not dead, but we need to destroy it and uproot it, that it never comes back again as soon as we possibly can. Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's my pleasure. You're the best. I really enjoy having you on, Wayne. So let's do it again in a couple of months. Remind me, we'll get you back on. We can flush out history a little bit further. And I want you to remind people where they can buy your book without having to go through the modern day book burning business over there at Amazon.
Classicalcapital.com. There are a couple of pages there that have buttons on it to buy. If you're in a foreign country, the postage charge, be sure to pick your correct tab, but it's easy to handle there, and we love to have this information. There's so much more about what was done to the people to starve them to death, to destroy industry, to try to destroy the middle class completely. It's much more complete and comprehensive in my book than I can possibly do in oral interviews. But I really appreciate the opportunity, Sean, to be with your audience, and thank them for their interest.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I noticed about 5 minutes into this interview, we forgot to start your video on your end. And last time we did have a video interview, but these audio interviews, people seem to like them just as well. It's a little podcast feature, I guess we'll call this one. This was a podcast this time, guys, with Wayne Jett. And you can get the book at classicalcapital.com, The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. Our guest has been Wayne Jett. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Sean.
All right. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in. You know how much we appreciate it. A special shout out to our patrons. Honestly, guys, you are truly 100% keeping me in this fight for truth and real news. YouTube is demonetizing SGT Report and other alternative media sources because they're trying to starve us out. And you guys are keeping us in the fight. Thank you so much for that. And hopefully President Trump will step up and rein these big social media fascist giants in and force them to stop this active censorship, blacklisting, and demonetizing, because they truly are the enemies of the people and the enemies of freedom and the enemies of truth. So thank you so very much. And for Real News 24/7, visit us at sgtreport.com, thephaser.com, and thelibertymill.com. Love you guys. God bless. Bye-bye.
Antarctica is very much a paranormal hotspot. Something is going on down there. The United States definitely has a year-round presence there at this point. But the question is, what's going on underneath the ice?